Tales from the Break Room features scary work stories from real people, and we want to hear your story next. Send it to us at darkstories.org. If you want to support the show, leave Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or buy the Wendigo coffee mug over at eeriecast.store. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Every time I feel like taking a weekend camping trip after a busy week at work, I catch wind of yet another terrifying story about something disturbing that happened in the woods. So I guess I'll just stay home, play video games, and get right back to the grind when Monday shows its nasty face again. Hey, welcome back to Dead and Roasted. You're just in time for my next break. And boy, do I have some scary work stories to share with you today, featuring creepy cadet training and vengeful hounds. Get yourself a hot cup of coffee and a donut stick. These are Tales from the Break Room. Ghost in the Cooler. From Texo, I am Texan. It was my first day working with my coworker and boss, J and G respectively. Jay frequently made jokes about the oven at the local 7-Eleven we worked at. It was a regular second shift, and we were joking about the oven always turning on or the camera shutting off because of Casper. We would laugh about it. On one occasion, another coworker, whom I despised due to our differences, started talking. She accused random customers of doing it, and even me at one point, before eventually saying, "You know, there could be a ghost. I've seen it." We were being positive, but her comment freaked both J and G out. I didn't like the fact she was scaring J, who's usually calm and easily scared by people like her. That day after she left, it felt as if the atmosphere changed. It was like she brought something with her. Mind you, she worked the graveyard shift, and many people at a place like that are dealing with their demons or bad habits, like drugs. Now, G isn't Christian, he's from India and believes that something bad has been brought here. I told G, well, if you ever hear a woman crying from nowhere, it's probably a banshee. After all, G, I'm Irish. If it's climbing up the wall, it ain't human. Later in the day, as it was hot, he told me to go to the cooler and cool off. So I did just that. This is where it starts getting weird. Usually nothing strange happens at the cooler, but this time I saw something. Mind you, this was after my birthday, so I had a bit of a hangover from some stout beer and whiskey. I was dealing with the sodas, beer, and whatever else needed to be done back there. Then I saw G walk in with a hammer, looking worried about something. Then I saw it. There was a slim, short man sitting on a 24-pack of Bud Light beer. It was weird. I tried to ignore it and go back to work. I saw G just standing there, unsure himself if it was real. Then the short, slim man ran right at me. He got into a boxing stance, and all at once, disappeared. G saw what happened, asking, "You saw that as well, right?" We weren't supposed to share this story, but I always assumed the entity wanted attention, like a child would. I began to call it Casper too, and nowadays it doesn't really do anything, save for infrequently appearing here and there, sitting in the corner, like a kid watching their mom cook dinner. We kinda just deal with it. Paranormal Hospital. From Thick Mick Chick. I've had several paranormal experiences in my lifetime, personally and professionally. I'll discuss the professional paranormal experiences in this story. I worked as a surgical technologist in labor and delivery for about 10 years. It was for a not-for-profit Catholic hospital for almost 4 years out of that 10. When I first started in the department, 2 techs that had already worked there for a very long time, M and J, told me stories about Sister Margaret, who was a surgery tech, back when the hospital was still run by nuns. Needless to say, Sister Mary Margaret was very much by the book and left little room for her coworkers' errors. Jay knew about Sister Mary Margaret, but Em had worked there so long she'd actually worked with the nun. Em began to tell tales about instances when she'd heard Sister Mary Margaret in the OR suite long after she'd passed away and up to the current time frame. Being a born skeptic, I thought Em and Jay were just hazing the new girl. I wasn't buying a bit of their nonsense. Well, fast forward to when I'm off of orientation, working my 12-hour night shifts. I'd be in the back, setting up the OR suite, or stocking supplies, and I could hear the shuffle of shoe covers. Just as high heels make the click-clack sound, there's a very distinct sound shoe covers make when they shuffle along the hospital floor. I just sleuthed it out, and I figured Em or Jay put one of the night shift nurses up to pranking me, just to see if I'd fall for it. Well, I just had to hop out of there, catch them in the act, and let them know they weren't fooling anyone. So I popped out into the hallway, ready to scare the scrub pants off of whoever was pranking me. But when I jumped out there, no one was around. There was no movement at all in the hallway, no swinging of doors, no chatter on the intercoms, nothing. I was really perplexed. This first incident got a shrug from me, and I went on with my work. As time passed, these incidents became more and more frequent. We had more new employees, and Em and Jay were training them. Em and her new orientee had an incident where sterile supplies were on the OR bed and a bulb syringe floated from the top of the supply pile at a 90-degree angle for about a minute, then just dropped onto the floor. I really started to believe them when they relayed that story to me during report. I could tell they were both honestly shaken up by the ordeal, and I actually felt pretty bad for them. They were scared. Trust me, these two were not actresses. There was no way they could have given such an Oscar-worthy performance. I continued having my own encounters with shuffling shoe covers, unintelligible whispering, all the hallmarks of a typical haunting. Some of my tech coworkers continued reporting the same kinds of activity. None of the activity was as egregious as what Em and her orientee experienced, what with the floating bulb syringe in midair. This would eventually stop being amusing to me. One early morning, I went to the OR suite at about 2:30 to 3 a.m. to stock linens and sterile water and saline into the warmer. For those of you not familiar with hospital warmers, they're the equivalent to leaving the hospital and going straight to Narnia. These miraculous inventions are what makes your hospital blankets so nice and toasty. We also put sterile water and saline in the top portion of the warmer, two heat-up liquids used externally, so the patient doesn't get hypothermic. To give you a visual, it literally looks like an industrial-sized stainless steel refrigerator. It performs in the same way, except instead of making everything cold, it warms everything up, thus being the hospital warmer. Anyway, I had taken the linen cart and some water and saline bottles with me to stock up everything. I left the cart in the hallway outside of our two surgical suites. The warmer was in between both OR suites in a little cubby beside our crash cart. As you very well know, hospitals are known for migraine-inducing bright light. This was one of a few things I disliked about working in a hospital. Whenever I was able, I'd spare the blinking fluorescent lights as much as possible. I proceeded to stock the warmer without turning lights on to spare myself the glare whenever I could. The OR suites were darkened and shadowy, but I could easily make my way around. I'm sure everyone is familiar with refrigerators and freezers. The fridge is cold, and the freezer part is, obviously, frozen cold. The warmers at a hospital basically work on the same premise. The fridge part warms the blankets, and the freezer parts makes the external water and saline bottles toasty. That's exactly what we want. So I opened the fridge part and expected to be hit in the face with some pretty arid heat. However, it was cold. Wait, I thought. Is it broken? I mean, it's gotta be. There's no way this warmer would be running cold. Something wasn't right. I then also checked the freezer portion, which should have been much hotter than the fridge portion. It was somehow colder. Nope, this wasn't right. It wasn't normal for the warmer to be this cold. The fans were blowing warm air, but it just wasn't warming anything up. It was then I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I had never felt that way at the job previously. I turned around, looking up to see a black mist smoke towards the top of the ceiling. At first, I thought that maybe some part of the warmer's electric components had fizzled out, and this was the beginning of a fire. The problem was, the black mist smoke was on the ceiling and in the opposite corner of the warmer. I checked the warmer's connections. Everything appeared to be where it was supposed to be. There was nothing wrong with the warmer at all. There was something in that OR suite cubby that was not friendly and rather malevolent. I knew it wasn't Sister Mary Margaret. She would never do anything menacing. I can't explain how, but I knew not only that it wasn't her, but I also knew she wasn't there to help protect me from whatever this was. It was slowly seeping down from the corner of the ceiling towards me and the warmer. I did what seemed to be the most sensible thing, and I began to recite the Lord's Prayer. That's when the mist smoke stopped completely. As I continued, it literally looked like a film being played in reverse. It slinked back into the corner it came from. As soon as it was just about gone, I turned to hustle out of that little cubby area and back into the hallway. I happened to notice then, when I turned around to face the warmer, it was back to its normally toasty temperature. I didn't ruminate on this long. I just booked it out of the OR suite to the hallway, back to the nurse's station. Until this very story here, I never said a thing to anyone. I didn't mention my experience to coworkers, friends, nor family. I honestly didn't want to be ridiculed. I just feel this is a story I'm no longer compelled to keep to myself. No harm in sharing it now. I hope you enjoyed it. Horse Farm Ghosts from M. Ruth 99. I'm a 23-year-old female. I moved to Kentucky about a year ago to work my dream job. I work on a horse farm as a groom, raising baby horses that will go on to be race horses. The farm I work on is made up of land that used to be several farms. There are many confirmed unmarked graves and a few marked graves. Given the hazards of the job of caring for half-ton prey animals, who knows how many of those graves belong to former employees? Almost every barn in use has its own ghost stories. My experiences happened at one barn last winter. I had a barn partner, and our job was to check the horses out in the fields and feed them. We had one staying in the barn on limited turnout due to a foot injury. She was outside, and I was cleaning her stall while my partner was out in the fields. Her stall was the only one with bedding, a water bucket, and feed tub. All the others were empty brick-bottom stalls. While cleaning, I had in one earbud, listening to some music. At the other end of the barn, outside, I heard two men talking. I thought maybe it was my bosses coming to check on the barn. I went to look and there wasn't anybody there, nor any trucks leaving the barn driveway. Slightly creeped out, I went back to work. Later, I was working in the break room, and I distinctly heard the sound of someone walking down the shed row, clicking the clasp of a lead rope. Click, click, click. I looked to see if my partner had returned, but I was still alone. Then I heard the sound of a feed tub being shaken. They have 3 clasps that rattle when shaken when we mix feed. I grew even more creeped out. After a while, after my partner had come and gone again, I was sweeping up hay in the hay room, something to do to keep busy until I had to set the stall for the horse. As I finished sweeping, I heard a horse rustling in its stall and snorting. The stall next to the hay room was empty. I later told my partner what I'd heard, and she said she too had heard strange things around the barn and had learned to deal with it as part of the job. As we talked, we both heard a woman laugh around the corner, but we were alone at that barn. It seems like this barn is still running from a bygone time, along with us living grooms. The start of a 2-year-long work horror story. From Anonymoose. When I was around 16, I began working at my parents' small snack business. This was basically the way my family taught responsibility, through working for an allowance. The place was situated at an old run-down gas station, which had been bought and converted into multiple business locations. It was not fancy in the slightest, nor did it look like a place anyone would want to work at. It was old, disgusting, and looked as though it was a breeding ground for drug addicts and rats. Nonetheless, it's what my family could afford, as the rent on one of these smaller buildings was quite low. One day, about 2 weeks into my time there, my dad was out on deliveries. I was left in the factory with one other girl. She was around 20 years old, and quite annoying to be completely honest. She liked to talk non-stop, and being an introvert, I didn't enjoy it very much. But I remained polite as I was a bit of a people pleaser back then. She had gone to the stockroom to restock some items, in order to make space for some of our orders of ingredients coming in the following workday, giving me a bit of a break. It was already dark out as we would usually work late on Saturdays. So there I was, in the dimly lit office space, filling out some invoices for the next week's deliveries. It was the first time I was ever truly alone in that place, so this was my first experience there. As I was working, I could hear the sound of Sarah packing items and humming in the stockroom. Looking down at my invoice book, I saw a shadow in the corner of my eye. I didn't think much of it, thinking it was maybe Sarah moving around past the doorway. I continued my work for another 10 minutes. I then saw the shadow moving toward me, slowly. Thinking that Sarah was trying to scare me, I spun around quickly to catch her in the act. But when I turned around, there wasn't another soul in sight. I called out for Sarah, hearing her response coming from the stockroom. I was perplexed at first, but soon brushed it off as my tiredness taking hold of me and me imagining it, or the light doing weird things with Sarah's shadow. Later in the evening, Sarah had come through the office area to go to the prepping tables to clean them up. She looked back at me and said, "Oh hey, nice try with trying to scare me in the stockroom. How did you get back to the desk so fast without breaking your neck?" She laughed. "Oh, what are you talking about?" I asked. "You stuck your head in the doorway a couple of times. What do you mean, what do I mean?" "Dude, that wasn't me," I said slowly. "Stop fooling around, Moose. It's not even funny after you already did it like 5 times. Denying it isn't going to make me believe you." But I started, but soon decided this back and forth was not worth the time and energy. Never mind. Slightly irritated, Sarah walked off into the prep area to continue her work. After around 20 minutes, she called out, "Moose, cut it out." "What?" I shouted back. I heard the sound of frantic footsteps, and I soon saw Sarah coming through the office door. Tell me that was you. Please tell me that you just tapped on my shoulder and ran off." "Sarah, I swear to God that wasn't me," I told her sincerely, hoping she would believe me this time. I was starting to get freaked out. It wasn't my first paranormal rodeo, but it was definitely the first time where actual touching was involved. I really wasn't sure what this was at the time. "Moose, call your dad. I want out of this place. Now," she said, fear in her eyes in a way I'd never seen before. After calling Dad and hearing that he was 10 minutes away, we quickly packed up our things, not even removing our work attire. We locked up and we waited outside for my dad to pick us up. Waiting outside was creepy enough on its own, but even more so with our experience looming over our heads. We both kept checking our phone screens for the time. When Dad finally pulled into the lot, he hadn't even stopped completely before Sarah and I began opening up the doors to hop in. Dad, surprised by our haste, asked, "What's up with you two? Where's the fire?" I spoke quickly to beat Sarah to it and shrugged it off, saying I'd started my period, that I was really cold and needed to be home before my cramps started up. He accepted the excuse, and we drove away. I couldn't sleep that night. I watched kids' movies all night, trying to make myself relax, only going to bed just as the sun rose. I worked there for around 2 years, and I have more stories from the place. Some paranormal, others just plain creepy people doing creepy people things. Just stay safe out there, folks. Work is something we all have to do one way or another, but I'm sure we all prefer a creepy-free environment. Mittens and Gremlins, from Jason R. Steve was always good for a chat. He and I could sit around and talk about nothing for hours. We were experts at it. There were several reasons for this. The first was that he and I were former military. The next, we were both at the time working security. And lastly, we both liked to tell stories about our times when we were back in uniform. I like scary stories about encounters with creatures. And as Steve was 65, he had more than a few to share. "You know, I used to work at a mall." I failed spectacularly to suppress a laugh. You gotta know how cliché that sounds. "Why, yes, actually, I do. And so did every customer who ever walked into that mall. They repeatedly reminded me." The look on his face let me know that he was going to continue, so I would need to keep my snark to a minimum. "Well, my favorite store to walk by there was the pet store. Think it was called Petland or something. I looked it up recently, and apparently Petland was a pretty big franchise. I loved the place," he said. "It smelled kind of funny though. Probably smelled a lot like you do right now," I said. Keep in mind, for being a former soldier, my jabs were rather tame. I then steered the conversation back on topic. "Yeah, it's always fun going into a pet store. But between the prices being kinda high and the cost of supplies," he cut me off. "You're cheap, I get it. But you know, whenever you go into those stores, it's always puppies. They always sell puppies, never full-grown dogs. But this place, at the time, had a full-grown dog. I guess it was kind of like a mascot or something. A sweet little guy. Pit bull terrier mix, all black and white. He belonged to the store's owner. But he had all these hip issues. I had to stop myself from mentioning that he and the dog really did have a lot in common. Steve was kinda beat up. "They called him Mittens," he said. "Sounds more like a cat's name." "Why you didn't become a detective escapes me," he replied sarcastically. He stopped for a moment and sucked down some coffee. "Yes, I think you're right. Mittens is a cat's name. I think he called him that because he thought it was funny. Anyway, the little pooch was a sweetheart, and he couldn't get around too well. The boss man did his best, treated him like he was one of the family. But he was busy, so he had to take Mittens to work with him. Now, normally Mittens would just sit in the corner. Every time I went in there, Mittens was there. He would smile at me, cock his head, and wag his tail. Yeah, I loved the little guy. Most folks did. I could tell then the story made him quite sad. He went on. Except these little jerks." "How many of them were there?" I asked. I was expecting a scary story, but a story about a pooch and some mean kids wasn't really doing it for me. Dunno, I think maybe 4 of them. Their sorry little tails would come by, run past, and smack him. Or they'd throw stuff at the poor guy. I think they poured a soda on him once, too. As he couldn't chase after him, he was an easy mark. I caught them doing it a couple of times. It teed me off really bad. Mittens didn't understand what was happening, didn't know why they did that to him. I decided at this point in the story to stop with the snark altogether. He seemed very sad and confused that people could do that to a poor dog. It was something that broke my cold, dead heart, too. Nothing's worse than treating a pet or child, someone innocent and naive, that way. He continued. So they tormented him, all up until the day he died, Steve said. I called him the Gremlins. He was getting on in doggy years and obviously wasn't in the best of health. Now, I'm guessing you're wondering why I'm telling you all this mush when you asked about scary things. Sure am. Well, it's what happened afterward that was scary. He took a second to swirl his coffee. Those brats began finding out what it's like to be scared and helpless. The man who owned that pet store, Will, told me that a couple of them came in and complained. I think he said one of their moms was with them. They said they didn't appreciate him sicking mittens on them and that their precious angels were only messing around before, that they didn't mean any harm. He smiled. I can only imagine the look on their faces when he told them straight out Mittens had passed away weeks ago. Naturally, they didn't believe him. They went to the cops. I imagine they were quite shocked when the cops checked and found out that, just like Will had said, Mittens had been dead long before something had terrorized their mutant spawn. They figured at that point some other dog had done it. And since Will didn't have any other dogs, well, so much for that. That is kind of creepy, I replied. That's nothing. One night one of the other gremlins was attacked. And I mean attacked. He had cuts all over. Kids always exaggerate things, but this one swore that it was a pit bull terrier that tore right into him. Sounds like one of Mittens' cousins got revenge for him. I don't think so. Mittens had a hip brace and had this little red clover stitched into it. Steve took a long slurping swig of coffee. And the dog that attacked that kid was mostly black and wore a hip brace with a red clover on it. You're not suggesting what I think you are. No, I'm flat out telling you. He came back all hellhound-like and got him some payback. Kinda harsh payback, don't you think? Kids back then sucked. Real mean and nasty little things. Geez, I said. Sounds like they were the same age as me. Steve then finished his coffee with a really annoying smile on his face. Does anybody have any idea what this could have been? From Luka J. A few years ago now, I had an encounter with, well, I'm not sure what it was. I was young, but this will stay with me forever. No doubt about that. And I remember everything in so much detail that I could swear it only happened yesterday. I should mention I live in the UK, though I hadn't been living here for a long time at the time this happened. I had only recently become fluent enough in English to even share this story with people who don't speak my native tongue. There were two friends, people I had met when I was assigned to my squadron, who also witnessed this thing. We'll call them Crops and Geek, for the sake of not sharing their real names. I was 15 back then, and I'd been on many trips with my cadets division in the military. This time was no different. Me, my squadron, maybe around 4 other squadrons, and our higher-ups all headed to a woodland we were all familiar with. There would have been around 30 of us at most. We packed up our assault packs, a term we use for rucksacks in the military. We loaded onto the 2 coaches we had to take us to our destination. Sleeping bags, mess kits, tarpaulin, axe, and other survival necessities were all we had other than the Glock 17s we were allowed for firearm practice and emergencies. It took a few hours for us to arrive, and when we all grouped up after getting off of our coaches, I heard one of my higher-ups speaking with the convoy's lead driver. They were discussing the extraction date and area. We had 2 long, nice weeks to ourselves in the wilderness. At first, the isolation was nice. We survived on salmon and other fish that swam in the rivers around us, as well as the odd bramble bushes we found that were safe to eat from. We moved around a lot when daylight lit the forest up from place to place. We went swimming in a lake whenever we got the chance. Everything felt so natural, so peaceful. That was until the 8th night. We set up camp per usual, built our own shelters from stray logs and branches, which we covered over with our tarps, and then littered with leaves and other foliage to make it blend in. There was a clearing around 6 or 7 meters from our camp, which was littered with deep, natural trenches. Some of the trenches were covered with fallen logs and branches. This made a perfect hiding spot, as it was blocked over from the top with just enough room to squeeze between the logs and the ground and lay there. It was only just getting near sunset. We'd all finished our meal of some kind of river fish with wild garlic. My commander then announced that we were going to gear up and play some tactical hide-and-seek to liven us up and wear us out so we would sleep well. Me and the other 4 members of our squadron all camouflaged our skin in dirt and camo paint sticks. We shoved leaves and debris anywhere that might expose us and dirtied any metal we were wearing so it wouldn't shine, giving away our locations. When everyone was ready, our higher-ups began to chant and sync, counting. 1, 2. My squadron and I booked it as fast as we could through the clearing, searching for hiding spots in which we could signal to each other when a seeker was nearby. 3, 4, 5. Crops and I stopped near the edge of the clearing, ducking into one of the covered trenches, signaling to Geek and the other 2 squaddies, squadron members, to let them know where we were. Geek was hidden in a ditch beneath some upturned roots of an old cedar tree, signaling when he was ready, so we knew that's where he'd be hiding. 6, 7, 8. One of the others flopped onto the ground in a small indent in the dirt. Pulling leaves over himself, Crops soon nudged me, letting me know he too had signaled. He was good. 9. We all lay as still and silent as possible, using our previous survival training to control and quiet our breathing. We were all maybe 12 meters apart at the very farthest. 10. We heard the higher-ups begin to search. It was obvious they had split into a few groups, hoping to find everyone more quickly. When a stick snapped somewhere to my left, I immediately turned my head to peek between the narrow gap some of the logs offered. I expected to see one of those higher-ups, maybe even my commander. Instead, I saw nothing. After an hour of lying motionless in the now dark clearing, silent in those trenches with the other squaddies, which by that point had been found, Crops nudged me. When I glanced at him, I noticed he had gone pale. He put a finger up to his lips, letting me know to stay silent. He then motioned slowly to the left. I expected to see a higher-up again. Instead, I saw something snuffling around in some bushes nearby, something that was pale. And even though it was at least 20 meters away, I could see its veins through its skin. I had no idea what that thing was, and it was clear to me that neither did Crops. It was getting closer, slowly, sniffing. 15 meters, still sniffing, getting closer. 10 meters, still getting closer. Suddenly, I heard the voice of my commander. He was yelling for us to come out, telling us we'd won. If it weren't for his yells, that thing would have continued until it did find us. Instead, we watched it raise its head in the direction of the camp where my commander was, before it disappeared into the trees outside the clearing. Shaken up, neither me nor Crops wanted to come out. But eventually, we did. We then ran all the way back to the camp. We didn't say a word about it to anyone, not even to our other squatties. I don't think they would have believed us anyway. We were young teenagers at the time, after all. By night, we'd both forgotten what we'd seen out on the far side of the clearing. Maybe not forgotten, we just put it out of our minds. We were enjoying some silence, all huddled together in our shared shelter. It was too warm at the time to get into our sleeping bags, so we were just lying on top of them to stay off the ground. Geek was beginning to doze off, but Crops and I and the other two squatties were on our stomachs, just talking with each other. We were discussing what we would do after the field trip, and all the things we had planned for the rest of the upcoming summer break. Our other two squatties had headed off to another squadron's shelter to stay with them, since that group was mostly their friends. We said our goodbyes and goodnights. Then me and Crops went back to just chatting. Eventually, everyone was asleep. I was the only one awake. I'd gone from enjoying the silence to very quickly realizing just how quiet it really was. No crickets, no squeaking of rodents, no snuffling of deer passing by the camp. It was a dead silence. From what I had learned in wilderness training, I knew this kind of absolute quiet only happened when there was some kind of predator nearby, lurking, hunting. I instinctively reached to the back of my waistband, where I preferred to keep my Glock. That's when I saw it. The same thing as before. That creature. It was in the clearing, sniffing the trenched area Crops and I had been in earlier. It knew we'd been in there. I moved over to nudge Geek awake to my left, then Crops to my right. I brought a finger to my mouth as a sign to stay quiet, nodding my head towards where that thing was standing. I didn't dare look away from it to see their faces, but I could tell they were both as horrified and scared as I was. In the dim moonlight, I could make out its pale, translucent skin, its slits for nostrils, and its gaping, deep black hollows where its eyes were meant to be. It was hunched over, but I'd say it probably stood at least 6 feet tall. Its hands and feet were huge, fingers long, with very obvious claws on each digit of its toes and fingers. It was so disproportionate, it looked like a human figure that had been twisted and elongated in strange ways. Just looking at it was so unsettling. That's when my blood ran cold. It was looking at us, right at us. Geek gasped quietly, reaching for his Glock 17 too, and soon Crops was doing the same, reaching for his. "What the heck is that?" I heard him whisper. "I don't know," I whispered back. I wanted to bolt for the higher-ups, but I found myself frozen in place, gripping my gun in terror as it began to slowly come towards us. I heard one of their gun's safeties latch off, and I did the same, aiming at that thing through my shaking hands. I don't remember much of what happened from that point. I know we didn't see it again after that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched until we all finally left. I don't know what that thing was, but I do think it's quite safe to say that I will steer clear of those woods for the rest of my life. I don't care how familiar I am with the area. I'll think twice about staying overnight in any forest again. That wasn't just Styrofoam, was it? From MovieManiac. I work at a small movie theater in my hometown, located in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. I had just finished my shift and was driving home, just the way I usually do, which was 5 miles outside of town and a couple of miles north. But right where you turn off, there's this cemetery that only my family still uses. Every other night I've driven past and nothing out of the ordinary happens. This time, however, I noticed what looked to be a piece of styrofoam sitting in the middle of the road. I pulled up next to it, and I was going to pick it up to get it off the road. As I got out to look at it, I noticed it wasn't a piece of styrofoam. Rather, it was one of the old headstones from the cemetery. This freaked me out, because how did a headstone get in the middle of the road when it was so darn heavy? I then began to walk into the cemetery. That was when I saw a man beginning to walk towards me. At first, I thought it was my dad. We only live a mile away from that cemetery. But it wasn't my dad. It couldn't have been any more obvious it wasn't him. It was this young man. He appeared to be in his 20s. He started off by saying, "My sister didn't believe the stories." I backpedaled as fast as I could to my car, and he almost tried to get in. He was gesticulating with his hands, making fists, which worried me beyond belief. I was so scared he was going to beat me to death. I backed up to the stop sign and drove a mile around the section to get to my house, so he wouldn't know where I lived. The story doesn't end there, however. I called my boyfriend to tell him what happened, and we were both freaking out. After I called him, I called the sheriff. He had deputies sent out to find the man. I sat at home with a knife, just in case the man decided to walk down the road to my house. Thankfully, he never did. When the police arrived at the cemetery, they saw the true damage to the cemetery he had caused. I'd only seen one headstone, but he had tipped over around 10 or more. The police said he used a car, but there were no car tracks in the cemetery, and I saw no car around. His car was upside down in a field half a mile from the cemetery. The headstones he knocked over were huge, and I think that something happened that we cannot think to fathom. While the damage he caused was bad, they couldn't find him until they found that someone had picked him up and brought him to a friend's house in town. He was arrested that night, and to this day I still get spooked having to drive by that cemetery. My coworker tried to kill me. From Roadrunner. This isn't my first story, so to catch you up, you need to know that Jared is our resident ghost at a popular dairy factory in southern Texas. Lately, he's been more active than normal. I know most people would have quit a job if they had evidence of an actual ghost being there. But I have a history of seeing things some people just don't see. Therefore, I've spent the last 10 years of my life learning about the supernatural, understanding the good and evil of it. Now, we had a new worker at the factory. We'll call him S. He's easily one of the weirdest guys I've ever worked with. Not funny ha-ha weird, but weird as in you don't want to see him pop up around the corner in the middle of the night. He lately has not been taking no as an answer for his flirting and unwanted advances. I've noticed that the more S comes around my area, the more I see activity from Jared. Such as one time I was working in the cage doing paperwork. I noticed that someone was watching me. Glancing over, I see S standing there. Now, I ignore it, since that's what you're told to do, is ignore stuff that makes you uncomfortable. As I go through my paperwork, I noticed my pen is flung from the desk to the floor, basically now pushed underneath the actual desk. I looked down and whispered, "Dang it, Jared, why would you do that?" I crawled underneath the desk, searching for my pen, and when I go to get back up, I feel wind rushing by me. I then hear a stack of crates fall right behind me. I jump at the sound, knowing that if I had stood up, I would have been hit by 75 pounds of milk. That's why, I say nonchalantly, as I move over the fallen crates to get out. But how'd they fall? I trailed off, as I see S standing there with a disgusting smirk on his face, practically admitting what he had done without even saying anything. Now, I know most of you would have gone to HR telling them what had happened, but being a pirate ship of a company, basically there's not a lot of cameras on the floor, and it can't catch everything. So in the end, it would just be my word against his. I just tried to avoid him completely. I remember to thank Jared for the quick save that his minor inconvenience had done, but that would not be as terrifying as what S had planned next. I started working a lot of weekends in order to get some extra cash for an upcoming vacation. Usually on the weekends, I tend to be alone when I work. It makes it easier for me to get things done. Thinking back on it now, I kind of wish I'd asked A or K to come work with me that weekend. Anyhow, that night I came in around 8 p.m. I immediately went to look for the 4 trailers I was going to need to have Yard Dog put in the bay for me. I stopped and tied my steel-toe boot that had come undone. I then looked up in the shadows between 2 trailers in the building, and I see someone standing there. The building light over them cast a yellow light on them, but their face was shrouded in shadows. I got an ominous feeling. I then said, "Well, hey Jared, long time no see. You've been acting weird. Can you tell me why?" As I stood up and began walking towards the figure, I got the feeling that I should turn around. Now, I've always been one to listen to my instincts, so I quickly turned heel and began to walk towards the opposite side of the trailer lot, where I knew my forklift would be. That's not Jared, I thought, as I picked up speed, hearing the sound of boots hitting the pavement slowly chasing after me. Now, I'm by no means a delicate flower, but I'm not foolish enough to believe that someone who would be out stalking someone at night would not have some sort of weapon on them. If I can reach my forklift, I can run them over or get away, I thought, trying to stay as calm as possible. I felt my heart beginning to slam inside my chest, adrenaline beginning to pump through my legs. The boots got ever closer, and I could feel tears starting to brim in my eyes. The composure I felt leaving my body was replaced with terror. I started to crouch run under trailers, making an effective shortcut to my forklift. I was about to reach it as I suddenly stopped. I held in a scream of terror as I spot a familiar figure next to me, and I hear a shushing sound. I recognized the calming presence. Jared. I did as he signaled, staying quiet. I saw someone run past the trailer towards my forklift. I noticed as they passed, my forklift keys were hanging from their pocket, my little cat keychain reflecting in the lamplight. It suddenly dawned on me, and I felt my stomach drop. Even if I'd gotten to my forklift, I couldn't have done anything, because my keys had been taken, preventing me from escaping. Tears quietly poured from my eyes as the realization of me dying was there. I began to crouch run towards a lower trailer that most men couldn't fit under. It was pitch black under there. I wiggled underneath. I knew who had been pursuing me. It was S. When I looked out, I even saw him, now heading toward the car lot up front. I waited there for about 20 minutes before crawling out and heading toward the guard's shack on the other side of the lot, silently thanking Jared the whole way. Now, I know what you're thinking, and yes, I reported him in order to get them to actually do something. I said how S had a gun, that he had been threatening me before. I explained how he chased me and took my forklift keys. The idiot didn't think about returning the keys where he'd found them, or at the very least ditch them. Lo and behold, they searched his locker and found them. They found his car trunk filled with tape and a bunch of trash bags too, along with lighter fluid. Who knows what S had in mind for me that night? He was terminated and arrested for attempted kidnapping. All I know now is that Jared saved me. I left him a pack of beer and a candy bar where he was buried, plus some flowers at the little memorial bench my job has for him. Before I go, I'd like to say that not all ghosts are bad. Sometimes, if you treat them well and with respect, you'll find yourself an unexpected ally. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails And you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at eeriecast.com.